Hi, everyone. I'm here tonight on behalf of the Betsy Hotel and FIU, Florida International University, and Culture Crusaders to welcome you to the 23rd virtual salon in a series that started in late March when COVID-19 took hold. With partnership from the Confidence and many community stakeholders, the Betsy and FIU have built a community of over 1,500 households in 6 months of Mondays to celebrate arts, culture, and conversation. The complete video documentation of all their other earlier events is available via the Betsy Hotel's website for those who are visiting for the first time. So thanks for coming here. And and if you'd like to catch up on the series, they're up there if you want to find them. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Paula Bunster, the VP and Director of Storytelling at Prism Creative Group and the editor of Culture Crusaders, our locally focused media platform. So tonight, I'm very excited to sit down in conversation with Nicholas Griffin, who's an exceptional author and essayist, and his words have been written for and featured in magazines like the London Times, Film and Television, and much more. Tonight, we're discussing his latest book released earlier this year, The Year of Dangerous Days, Riots, Refugees, and Miami in 1980, which is every bit as awesome as that title makes it sound. So thank you so much for being here, Nicholas.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I actually have his book here, like a true fan. So after this conversation, you'll definitely want to pick it up yourselves, and you guys can pick it up at local bookstores like Books and Books, who also carry it, and you can support a local business. Please be sure to throw in any questions or topics or ideas that pop into your head during the conversation in the chat, and we'll field them towards the end. We'll probably talk around 45 minutes, and then we'll leave the last 15 minutes to any questions or curiosities you might have. So let's get started. That title is as exciting and intriguing as it sounds. So I definitely wanted to hear from you what inspired you to write this book specifically, and why this moment in Miami's history and in our country's history.
Sure. So I moved down to Miami full-time about seven years ago. And, you know, I always begin by sort of trying to figure out where I am and why I'm there and what's going on in the city I'm living in. And I had a lot of questions, simple questions that no one seemed to quite be able to answer. So I started digging around myself. And the first really dumb question I asked is, how come, you know, we're living in what seems to be the only American city where normally American cities, they absorb their immigrants, and in this case, the immigrants seem to have absorbed the city. And you go to Boston, and yes, it has an Irish heritage, but everyone feels very American. You go to New Orleans, no one's really speaking French. You go to San Francisco, no one's speaking Spanish there anymore. So, you know, what's going on here in Miami? So that was my first big dumb question. And then, of course, every time I kept digging about, you know, these huge Miami and American themes, whether we were talking immigration or whether we're talking race, and obviously we all know the importance of drugs and cocaine has in the history of Miami. Actually, the same people kept mentioning things that happened in the year 1980. So I started digging more and more and more. And then what I began to realize is, oh my God, all these huge pivotal moments in Miami's history not only happened in the same year, most of them seem to overlap with one another during basically the same 6 to 8 week period. And at that point, I was like, oh my God, I should, you know, maybe I should dig a little bit deeper and deeper and deeper. And sure enough, when I started trying to construct how a book might look, it seemed like a very obvious idea that I should stick within this 12 months of 1980. Originally, I'd wanted to write something much more broad. I thought, oh, this story starts here, but look how it sort of bends and weaves, and, you know, maybe I should bite off a 5-year chunk of Miami history. Wouldn't that be fun? And then I started doing the research. And the first thing I realized doing the research is that the Miami Herald has never digitized 1980 or 1981. So I had to sit there with microfiches, sort of plowing through, you know, day by day. And I thought, oh my God, you know, I think it took me over a year to read the microfiches for 1980 for, you know, all the pertinent newspapers. And at that point, I was like, there's no way I'm going to 1985. Otherwise, I'm going to be a very old man, but my kids are going to be married and I'll be a granddad by the time I finish.
Well, I mean, you still do a very good job of, you know, establishing the stage and the setting for, at least 2 decades before this, and the things and the decisions made by specific people that helped kind of build the ladder to this culmination of events in 1980, which, by the way, on a general level, for those of you listening, we're talking about the Arthur McDuffie riots, the Mariel boat lift, and the sort of climax of the cocaine industry in Miami, which it really is just so incredible that so many important moments happen within such a short period of time of each other. And it is a period of Miami that does get covered a lot, in film and television, and it's always kind of turned into this sexy thing, but you really do such a good job of tearing away that, shoulder pad, sunglasses, aviator side of 1980, and showing, what the Oz behind the curtain sort of thing. And sometimes I kind of found myself while I was reading it, like, wow, it must have been so difficult for so many communities to live in the city at that time, and it really is just so incredible. But, as someone who wasn't born in Miami, like you said, the interesting characteristic here is that Miami's immigrant communities absorbed the city. And it's true. Well, nowadays we see the Cuban influence as such a huge part of Miami's overarching personality. But what it was before that is also so interesting. So it is awesome. I wanted to kind of talk about how these things all came to head at a specific moment. Racial injustice, immigration, crime and corruption. And if anyone's listening, it sounds eerily similar to something else we might be experiencing today. What else do you think attributed to the fact that these things all came together at the same time in Miami?
Sure. Well, I think now as then, the first thing you always have to look at is the strength of the institutions that are supposed to represent you. And I think in 1980, the first one, really the first two that proved to be much weaker than they should have been, were weaker because of what had happened, not because of cocaine bloodshed, but because of that first wave of cocaine money. And the two institutions I'm talking about are, one, the local banking institution, and two, the local police departments. So banking, which, there were no money laundering laws in 1980. That seems almost impossible now, right? Because, there's always a new money laundering case every 5 minutes, but in 1980, that wasn't true. So what you got was this incredible wave of cocaine money that arrived in 1980. And I have to give you a couple of numbers just so you can realize that this just hadn't been seen before anywhere in the world, and certainly not in America. So when the feds realize that there's a real problem in Miami is when they basically look at their regions every quarter, and you should have, in 1979, you should have had around $100 million of a deficit or surplus, and then you either take a little bit of money out of the region or you put a little bit in. South Florida was suddenly generating a $7 billion surplus. Now, everyone in Washington looked at each other and went, well, it must be from some legitimate industry that we just don't know about. Maybe it's, I don't know, is it horse racing? What could it possibly be? And of course, they quickly came to realize that the answer was, you can't get a legitimate industry that comes out of nowhere and creates $7 billion within a year. So that meant it really was cocaine. And that was a surprise to everyone. Even DEA agents who weren't based in Miami. The ones who were based in Miami knew what was going on. Everywhere else in America at that time, if you asked the DEA, what's your number one problem? Everyone would have told you it was heroin, right? In 1980, that all changes. It's now obviously going to be cocaine. So what that does, when that amount of money hits Miami, first, where are those guys going to park the money? Well, it's very hard to have that much cash. You're literally talking, some of these early money launderers, like the guy I focus on in this book, he has to buy apartments just to keep that weight of cash in places, right? Every day, he's got $1 million in 20s in the back of his Chevy, and he's going up to these banks. So, of course, what do you need? You need banks who are going to look the other way. And, of course, when the feds do their first deep dive in, they've immediately fined 26, not one or two, 26 Miami area banks that are happily accepting drug money. So that means your financial core of your city is already gone. Now, the next thing that really weakens things in 1980 is what that money does to police departments. And so, of course, the other place that's going to bump up to cocaine very early on is the homicide department. So in county homicide, you've got this group of cops who are the specialists, the very guys you need to rely on to crack the cocaine trade, because these are actually all your Spanish-speaking cops within county homicide. There are not that many cops in county homicide at this time. I think it's 26, right? So a low-level cocaine dealer, not even one of the big guys, a low-level guy has more than enough money that if you throw 10,000 over here and 20,000 over there, you've basically got, I think he had a third of county homicide working directly for him by the end of 1979. So he would say, go bust that guy, go bust this guy, and they'd do what he was. They'd do what he wanted, including perhaps 3 or 4 murders that have never been proved, but they all link back. So you're about to have this incredible uptick in Miami of violence, of murder. You're about to break every record in America in 1980. And what do you need to lean on? You need to lean on your homicide department. Guess how many detectives have more than 1 year experience by the spring of 1980? 3. So, you know, what are you going to do? So
Miami forever, you know, being affected by its age there too. Lack of experience a little bit. Is this kind of, you know, obviously lack of experience, but deep connection to crime and corruption in such a pivotal moment of its history? Is this a pattern that you see in other American cities or in other countries, or is this a solely Miami story?
I mean, this is a solely Miami, you know, just to be the landing place for a whole new industry was something that hadn't happened before. Of course, there are other times in American history where there were, I mean, the time we always get compared to is you know, Chicago in the 1920s and Capone and all of that stuff. But this was something unique. And of course, Florida had this incredible history of corruption, and you know, we've still got quite a decent, you know, the only thing we're missing now is a you know, newspaper with $1 billion to spare to go and dig away at all the corruption that I'm sure is still happening all around us. But the weird thing is, here we are as, you know, South Floridians, and we're used to having pretty bad politicians representing us. But I would argue that in 1917, 1980, one of the things that saved us was having some pretty serious, honest people at the highest levels. And I would count among that a very solid county manager, which was absolutely key, a really progressive, business-friendly mayor who was fantastic, who's one of the centers of this book. Governor Bob Graham was in charge. So, you know, you had guys you could actually lean on who at least were going to be straight and weren't you know, on the take already, because, you know, half of Miami was on the take in 1980.
Yeah, and another great takeaway from that moment is just how essential local governments are, you know, to your immediate experience as a citizen in a city. So when the federal government kind of turned its back on what was happening in Miami throughout this time, where the Carter administration kind of shot themselves in the foot for not really helping a city that was direly in need, it was these local figures that really at least helped it survive something so tumultuous as that year.
Yeah, I mean, let's not forget 1980, like 2020, was an election year. So as Miami began to fall apart, and also don't forget that our mayor, Maurice Ferré, in 1980, was a good friend of the president's. So there was this expectation that, hey, I've done a lot of work for you on the campaign trail in 76 to get you into power. You know, now my city's in trouble. Can we have a little help, please? And the answer was, probably not.
Not right now. Yeah.
Not right now. Get to the back of the line. So yeah, Miami was kind of left to hang out to dry for a while. And I think what's extraordinary is that meant it had to rely on you know, really local answers. And the first thing that you got was an incredible, certainly during the Mariel boat lift, what the Cuban American community started to do for the new arrivals was remarkable to begin with. Then things go a bit belly up when they realize that there are actually 4,000 criminals hidden among the 125,000 refugees who've just arrived in Miami. That shakes things up. But there was this incredible local effort to get things right with or without federal help.
Yeah, it is one of the, shining moments I felt in the book for me, where there felt like there was no support. And especially, it is something we always think that we move towards in our societies, where people will become more acceptant and more welcoming. But actually, we're constantly reminded that there are people who don't welcome immigrants and new populations and assimilate them into societies. And here were these Cuban Americans bringing this, over 125,000 people into a city, make their experience somewhat more livable. It was a very, inspiring moment amongst the rubble. Is there anything, within the book that you kind of want readers to leave with, outside of a history lesson? Is there anything that you feel like we can learn from how we, survived and quote unquote got out of such a pivotal time?
Yeah, I think, if you think about what Miami was at the beginning and the end of 1 year, there was an extraordinary amount of change. And yet, I think if you think of it from 40 years later, I think now we'd say most of those changes were good. But when you're in the middle of those changes, they feel very threatening. And there was a lot of harsh reactions that took place during that year that I think people would probably have later stepped away from and regretted. And, I think we're in one of those, hopefully we're in one of those places now where a lot is being said that maybe a year from now, people might be stepping away from such strong opinions. I mean, I would say certainly for the recent arrivals from Mariel, it was an incredibly tough time. They'd risked everything to come, right? The way Mariel happened was that this bus with just 6 asylum seekers crashes through the gates of the Peruvian embassy. Fidel Castro is so angry that the Peruvian ambassador won't hand them back that he leaves those gates unattended and says, you know what, if anyone doesn't like my socialist paradise, you can just walk through and go. And to his horror, 10,000 people walk through those gates the next door, and he has to shut the embassy down, right? So those people are then kept in that embassy for days with barely any food or water. It's a really miserable, difficult time. If they do opt to try and go home to pick something up, they're attacked, they have rocks thrown at them, they're beaten. So then they're finally allowed to leave Mariel. They have to survive a sea journey where they're very deliberately overpacked by the Cuban government to the point where people are dying at sea during Mariel, and it's not an easy passage. Then when they get here to America, within 2 weeks they discover that it becomes a national scandal that the prison population has been smuggled over as well. So even though they only constitute 3% of the 125,000, it taints the whole 125,000. And the New York Times, which was running op-eds in their support a week later, is now running op-eds against the Mariel boat lift. So, you just don't even want to admit that you're from Mariel at that point. And people are people lie about that for the next 20 years. So I think from this perspective, you would say, if anything, they just, they're here, they were here legally, they were accepted by Carter, let's give them a break. And that's, what should have happened. It did happen in many cases. And I think the crazy thing is within 3 years, that group of immigrants from Mariel have exactly the same job rates, the same housing rates, the same kids in school rates as every other successful immigrant community. But boy, did they get humiliated in public during 1980.
Yeah, the image of Tent City and the Orange Bowl is enough to really, put things into perspective for sure. And the fact that there was an anti-bilingual campaign that won, actually, where people weren't allowed to speak in the only language they knew. It really, there are a lot of parallels between a lot of the things that are happening around the world. So it's pretty interesting. And even that, obviously you can find parallels between what we're experiencing today. But one thing that I kept on getting reminded while reading this book was the fact that and we were, talking about this before, was that Miamians really don't know the extent of their city, even something as far back, as not so far back as, 40 years ago, how important all these, selections of events that come together were into creating the city that we know and have a love-hate relationship today. I kind of wanted to know your thoughts on why you thought maybe there isn't this connection to Miami's history. Is it because a lot of us have we're first generation born, so our parents don't have that connection to America in the way that other cities do? Or is it because there is just so much that happened that we can't catch it all?
Yeah, I think it's probably more to do with the fact that even then, we relied so heavily on tourism even up to 1980 that the temptation was that just as Carter wanted to sweep 1980 under the carpet, and especially Miami under the carpet, so did the Chamber of Commerce. So did most people in Miami. And the irony is that in 1981 in the spring, the mayor's campaign to try and get the tourism kick-started again was to embrace Miami's problems. So he got 60 journalists from all around the world to come here in March of 1981. And the whole point of that trip was not only to prove that Miami's beaches hadn't changed and, there's still amazing restaurants, it was to give them tours of the riot zones from 1980. It was to give them, a glimpse of, what was happening in the cocaine trade. And they were taken to Tent City to show where desperate immigrants had been sleeping 6 months before. And I think that changes Miami, because then if you think about it, very next two cultural stepping stones for Miami are Scarface and Miami Vice, which is 1982, 3, and then 1984. And so you then get Miami sort of embracing this dark side and finding out that actually you don't have to sweep the dark side under. The dark side is kind of sexy to people. So people are perfectly happy to come to the town of Scarface because it's suddenly a cool town again. It's all a bit perverse, but in a way you would have hoped that would have led to a more serious consideration of the things that were happening around the cocaine trade. But for some reason, it was the cocaine trade that everyone remembers for whatever was sexy about it, rather than the context of what else was happening in 1980, which actually probably had much more effect on the city we live in today.
Well, exactly, since that is the only, side of the story on Miami's identity that was even being put forth by Hollywood too. People would come searching for that in the same way that people go to Chicago and want to look for, the gangster history and the steps where people were shot. It's kind of this voyeuristic, theatrical side of the city. But when you really take a step back, you realize, like, holy crap, that must have been so scary to live in. The fact that our downtown was pretty much uninhabited after 5 p.m. because it was, the apex of where all of this stuff would kind of go down. So it's a different image of that romantic, cool factor that's usually portrayed.
Yeah.
And actually, on that same level too, there are so many serendipitous moments that come together at the same time that make you wonder, would these series of events had collided in this same way had this thing not happened? Had Edna Buchanan, the Pulitzer Prize winning writer who pretty much broke open the Arthur McDuffie trial, which starts the book off, had she not been tipped off to the outstanding evidence, had the Arthur McDuffie trial not been so huge for the community, if the bus hadn't crashed into the Peruvian embassy, had the Mariel boat lift not ever happened, had the Cuban community not ever come to Miami in such a huge tsunami, it really, did you continue to keep finding these sort of uncanny, coincidental moments as you did your research? And is it something that you kind of started to notice as a pattern, or was it just much as a surprise?
Yeah, I keep these ridiculously huge documents, as I begin to piece together what's happening in the year, and one of them is like a calendar. So I can always, I can be like, oh my God, look, these things are actually happening 2 hours apart. Yeah, and there's some really weird ones, like the idea that the single worst day in the history of Miami to me is the day of the McDuffie riots. And for obvious reasons, the police and the National Guard lose control of huge sections of the city for over 48 hours, and 18 people are murdered, hundreds end up beaten and in hospitals, and there are, I think, almost 400 fires set around the city. So, you know, it's a total war zone. But on that very same day, people forget that the biggest ever loss of life during the Mariel boat lift happens when a boat that the Cuban authorities have deliberately overloaded, filled with children and families and a few prisoners, sinks in the middle of the Florida Straits. And a lot of people die, including 6 members of one family. So, you know, it's this double tragedy and these things are happening at exactly the same time. And, you know, there are other weird incidents, such as the night when Arthur McDuffie is beaten to death by 15 white policemen. For those who don't know, Arthur McDuffie was a 33-year-old black ex-Marine and insurance salesman, and the chase started because he ran a stoplight, and then he kept running. And then 8 minutes later, the police catch up with him. He gives up, and then he's beaten into a coma and dies. But the very night that he's doing that, the guy who instigates the entire Mariel boat lift is let out of prison in Cuba. Now, you know, who knows what the universe is trying to tell you, but I'll tell you something. Everything kept coming at Miami that year.
Truly, truly. It also feels like, you know, for history nerds, it's awesome to read because you're eating a huge ice cream sundae of just so much information on such an incredible city. I was born and raised in Miami, and I've pretty much only ever lived here. So for someone who always felt like she thought she knew the history of the city, this was just a huge eye-opening awakening, and it's something I feel like every generation should know. I'm sure there are people here who are like, I was here in 1980, I knew, and there would still be an insane amount of information probably they weren't privy to. So it really is just so much fun to read. And one thing I think for me that makes it such an exciting read too is that each of the characters read like these awesome badass protagonists that you see in shows like The Wire and True Detective and these, you know, true crime thriller shows, and you make them so personable and humane, which that's the irony, right? Because they actually did exist, so of course. But the amount of details that you're able to use to build up these important characters, the mayor, Edna Buchanan, Marshall Frank, it really does feel like you're rooting for these people, even though I could have easily just picked up my phone and Googled what happened. You know, I never wanted to. I wanted to see it through the way you were portraying it, which makes it so interesting to read. How are you able to get all of those details, you know, from interviews and microfiches, but also, you know, about these specific people that lived and some are still alive in Miami?
Yeah, well, I mean, the lucky thing for me was that a lot of these people were kicking around, and out of there are 4 central characters. Unfortunately, we lost Mayor Ferre at the end of last year, but you know, I did have 3 out of the 4 alive when I began my research, and they were all kind enough to sit down with me on multiple occasions. That, of course, there's nothing like that right now. Luckily, also for me, all 3 out of the 4 had also left extensive written records. They'd either written books or autobiographies, or, you know, that there was sort of like a bones I already had, so that I could then, you know, set those bones over my timelines and then go, oh, I wonder what they were doing on that day, or how about that, or how were they involved in that case, or why weren't they in that case? And especially in the case of Marshall Frank, who, if you don't know, was the captain of homicide during the single worst year in any county homicide department on history to this day. And then, of course, because Edna Buchanan, who's also one of my main characters, was the #1 crime reporter for the Miami Herald, those two, of course, had met already over crime scenes for years. So there's sort of a pre-existing relationship between them, which sort of made it fun for me to bounce between them. And then, of course, you had this wonderful character, the mayor. Now, mayors, you know, what do we all know about our mayors? Not much. But in this case, Mayor Ferre has this extraordinary backstory, right? He's born one of the richest men in the Caribbean. His father has made $400 million, and he's inherited the whole company. And then just as he's becoming mayor and still in his end of his first administration, he loses everything. They leverage their company, and the recession hits, and down the river they go. And suddenly, he didn't even accept his mayoral salary when he began, and suddenly he's going to accept his $186 a week or whatever it is to be mayor, instead of his $400 million that he had just before that. So there's these amazing tales of gain and loss, but they were just great characters. And the real truth to that question is that when I first handed this book in, my editor wrote to me and said, "You do realize that if this was a movie, you have," and she'd counted 109 speaking parts. Yeah. Right? She's like, no one is going to be able to follow this. There's a rat's nest. Get rid of this. So we sat down and we were like, who are the real voices to tell this story? And even though I was kind of leaning in this direction anyway, we went after the captain of homicide, the mayor, the crime reporter, and the #1 money launderer, a Colombian. So we figured those were the right voices to tell the story. And of course, there's certain jobs that let you crisscross anywhere. Journalist is always one of them. This is why journalists and detectives are always in crime fiction, right? They, all it takes is one murder or one story, and you can shoot these characters anywhere. But the same is true in nonfiction. You can follow these characters across sort of, all social boundaries. So that they're always, they're repeat characters in Netflix series and books for a reason.
Yeah, definitely. What was funner for you, diving into the characters, or taking all of this insane amount of information, which is the story, and putting it together?
Oh, that's the hard work. Yeah, that's not always fun, and that involves a lot of building up and breaking down, or having it broken down for you by your editor. The fun stuff is sitting down for another coffee with characters like Edna Buchanan, or driving north to when you'd track down someone you were almost convinced you were never going to get to. So I met a wonderful detective who lives up on the side of a mountain in Tennessee, who actually married another amazing detective, and she did fantastic work as well. So I could go up there and they were like, what, just come up and stay with us. So drove up and spent a few days in Tennessee getting all these extraordinary stories from the 80s. And the other thing, you think you're after them because they're involved in one case, and then you mention another case and they're like, oh yeah, I was in that case as well. My name wasn't in the record, but I did A, B, C, D. And once you're sitting down with people, all these more and more coincidences keep popping up, and one thing leads to another.
Yeah, that's the beautiful part of putting together a story, that word of mouth, the nuggets that you pick up from just passing conversation really just brings it all together. One of my favorite lines towards the end of the book, I'm going to butcher it, so please forgive me, but you describe Miami as like a Latin American city before being an American city. But there were a lot of things that happened in this year in Miami that influenced the way the rest of America did things. For example, was it Operation Greenback, for example, that the DEA, the solutions from this, breaking of the cocaine and drug money laundering trade here in Miami were eventually written into law and then enforced in other, departments around the country.
Yeah. So what happens is Greenback is the first big operation where you've got these it was set up as an interdepartmental, which was very ambitious then. And the truth is, two of the people who were supposed to show up, the DEA and the FBI never shows up to join the IRS and customs, and DEA shows up about 6 months late, because of course not everyone likes one another. We've all seen or heard this before, but it becomes incredibly influential because they basically brought these armed accountants down. If you've never seen a CPA with a machine gun, 1980 was the time to do it. But this idea of forensic narco accountancy is something that Greenback creates, and they realize that it's just so much quicker to go after the bad guys by following the money, and rather than the DA chasing kilos of coke around the country. the DEA actually learns how to do narco accountancy through Greenback as well. And then this is something you see pop up all across the country. And then, as you said, the guys who are at the heart of Greenback in Miami in 1980 and 81 are the ones who are eventually sent to Washington to go and write the laws for anti-money laundering activities. So that, they play this huge, important part.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I meant too, is like that as Miamians, we never really are told how there are parts of our history that should be embellished and are embellished in overarching American way of life, so, and that's one, it's not the nicest one, but it does have an effect on our country. And what a way to go that the money launderer, I want to keep referring to them as characters, but there are people who actually exist and existed, so it's funny to do that. But the way he goes out with a bang, was it on Brickell Avenue, right?
Yeah, right on Brickell. Yeah, there you go. I mean, in theory, as we've all seen our fair share of narc shows, and the money men never touch the drugs, and the drug guys never touch the money, and that's the way it's supposed to be. And then Operation Greenback had the luckiest day of their lives, in which the day they actually caught him with cocaine on him, several pounds. Not a large amount compared to what he was helping launder every year, but enough so that instead of facing a maximum of 5 years, he's now facing a maximum of 20 years. And of course, with that kind of leverage, it encouraged him to actually tell the story of what he was doing, not who, they never wanted to. He had a lot of family still in Colombia, and they knew that he would take 20 years rather than have his family killed. But he did walk the Operation Greenback agents through how they were moving money in and out, which banks, were doing what. So, immensely useful. But that came down to that stroke of good fortune.
Yeah, and not to mention a few hitmen who, messed up here and there too, that just kept on getting crazier and crazier. But looking at the way Miami was built, in the book at this time, it's there are a lot of differences. Obviously, you can see how much Miami has evolved in such a short amount of time since this crazy year. But there are also a lot of things I noticed that Miami still has, maybe not as a result of 1980, but for example, the fact that Miami is a city that is very siloed in different cultures and communities. And you can go through, I know a lot of cities in the world have this, but the fact that there are communities who could be struggling so difficultly in a city, and a community literally right next door could be completely aloof and unaware, is very disturbing. But it's also a very Miami personality trait. What do you think Miami, could do differently to provide a more united front, or are there reasons that come directly from this year that have caused that kind of separation of cultures and communities?
Yeah, I think, one of the tragedies of 1980 is if once you learn your 1980 history and then you peer across Miami and visit the same neighborhoods today, the areas of extreme poverty and underdevelopment in 1980 are exactly the same ones there are today. Now, one school of thought says, well, there was, and this is true, there was an enormous amount of development scheduled for Overtown in 1980, including, I think it was a $50 million block that was going up right then and there, that's then burnt down during the riots. But basically those areas don't recover. Why don't they recover? Well, A, when they go looking for federal funds and actually state funds to begin with, Governor Graham tries to push through $281 million of funds in the wake of the riots to rebuild Liberty City and Overtown and to sort of try and kickstart their economies. And instead of 281, Tallahassee gives them, I think it's 8 million with strings attached. And the idea there was that they didn't want to be seen to be rewarding rioters. But at the same time, they never addressed the underlying reasons for the riots in the first place. And that issue is still very much with us. Why is this community still living at a much in poverty compared to others, and it's still totally true today. You've got 25% youth unemployment in Overtown. It's probably more right now. That was pre-COVID. So, how do you fix that? Well, you've got to invest in the community. You've got to make schools, this redlining issue is still here. It was here then. Some of the black policemen I talked to, including ones at the heart of the story, tell tragic stories of, arriving early at school, the week before to help unpack all the books, and they, tear open the boxes to get to their new books, and then they realize because their school's segregated, they're actually getting the white kids' books from the previous year. And not just that, the white kids know where their books are about to go. So all the messages inscribed on each page, you can begin to imagine what those messages might say. But that sort of humiliation, that's how you start your school year, knowing that you're considered a second-class citizen by your county where you live. That's part of the package. The other concept was that, Liberty City, for example, I have the stat in my book somewhere, I can't remember it. I think it has something like 120 churches and 7 banks, none of which were black owned. So, that was 1980. So here we are, there's no passing of generational wealth because there was no accumulation of it in the first place. It was designed so you couldn't. So those things haven't changed. And those things, I think, these are conversations we're finally having in 2020, but wouldn't have been nice if we'd had a more coherent conversation about these things in 1980.
Yeah, no, definitely. And one thing that we kind of haven't really spoken about, which I think is probably the thing that is still most prevalent, at least in Miami's overarching identity, as in regards to tourism and economics, but the fact that Mayor Ferre at the time had this vision to establish Miami as, quote unquote, this gateway to the Americas, which, at that point was a pipe dream vision, but he had a point in a lot of ways to do that. And now, we still call it the gateway to the Americas. It's still this forward-facing port town. Can you talk a little bit about that too?
Sure. Yeah, because Mayor Ferre, when he first gets involved in politics, one thing's very obvious, that this is a southern town in the 60s when he first gets involved in politics. And he actually becomes part of something called the Non-Group. And the Non-Group was this off-the-record gang of the richest, most powerful men, and they were all men, in Miami, who basically set the agenda for what should and shouldn't be happening at the macro level in the city. They basically didn't trust county governments. They didn't trust the city government, which were, which, let's face it, are a strange, if you tried to take an order around COVID from the confusion of Suarez and Jimenez, and then you know what we're talking about. It doesn't necessarily work very smoothly, and the Non-Group decided to sort of do things themselves. They're like, well, we'll just set the agenda and everyone else will just follow our orders, which is pretty much what was happening then. So when Ferre becomes mayor, he leaves the Non-Group. So he then develops a totally different idea for Miami. All those guys in the Non-Group are thinking, how do we make the city wealthier? They're not bad men. They're civic-minded men. They want a better Miami, but they want a better version of New Orleans, a better version of Atlanta, a better version of Jacksonville, and a bit of New York banking. That's the aim. Now, Ferre thinks of something completely different. Ferre is born in Puerto Rico, and he's looking at the map as a Puerto Rican would. He sees this wide map where, the Caribbean's in this map, Latin America's in this map, Central America's in this map. And if you look at that map, it looks very different. Miami's actually becomes a hub. So Ferre was like, wow, we're in this extraordinary position where if we don't look north, if we stare south instead, we could become this service sector city for all of Latin America, including the Caribbean. But we could become this trade center through which trade moves north and south. And that's basically what he did during the next 7 years between 73 and 80. He becomes the Secretary of State for the Caribbean and Latin America without ever asking permission to be this guy, but he's flying around meeting with presidents and interior ministers and foreign ministers, and he's putting together these extraordinary deals. He puts together the trade show of the Americas, and there's suddenly all this trade coming through Miami that didn't come through Miami before. And what's he leaning on? He's leaning on the fact we've got this international airport that's already there that happens to fly to first and second cities in Latin America. We've got this Spanish-speaking infrastructure that he's suddenly leaning on that wasn't there pre the arrival of the Cubans in 1960. But 15 years later, they're well established, and You can run backroom operations in Spanish in Miami, no problem. And you know, it's an extraordinary decision for Miami, and it's actually helped by the crises in 1980. Because although those crises look like they're going to destroy the city, what it does is actually accelerates change. So for instance, as we talked about this movement where people wanted Miami to be anti-bilingual and, you know, enough with this Spanish, you know, all those people who made those votes against Miami as a bilingual community, a lot of them picked up sticks who were white and went north to Broward. Now that meant the Latin population, who previously were not interested in American domestic politics because most of them were Cuban Americans and most of them only cared about Castro as an issue, suddenly were like, oh my God, we're not truly welcome here. Maybe we should have more of a say in domestic politics. So they finally registered to vote. Beginning of the year, they were only registered at 17%. By the time the next year comes along, they've got Cuban Americans have 6 guys running for mayor. So it's this huge awakening, and it really energizes the city and pushes it towards becoming a Latin city, not away. So that's one of the great ironies of 1980 is that you know, the white citizens win the ordinance to make Miami monolingual again, and of course, look at us.
Definitely. I can't help but also think, you know, as a local, someone born here, for, you know, Miami's coming back into this kind of cultural renaissance moment. There's a lot, well, pre-pandemic, let's just talk about, let's just talk 2019 and before. You know, it has for a very long time been seen as this transient city that is heavily focused on tourism and trade, and that is a wonderful thing, and it's usually indicative of a port city around the world. But for people who live here 365 days a year, by the way, everyone listening, we are sort of nearing the end of the conversation, so if there are any questions that pop into your head, please make sure to put them in the chat here and on Facebook Live. But we just want to make sure to get them in. I could nerd out with him forever, so. But, you know, it is a very transient city, which means that people who live here 365 days a year don't see themselves that much in the identity of the city. There aren't that many, you know, community centers or institutions and organizations that help make people's daily lives here feel more connected and supported in the way that you see in other cities in the United States. And I can't help but feel like a result, that is a result of, for a very long time, those people who are in positions of leadership and power have kind of been putting more value and precedence on trade and tourism as opposed to those of us who live here 365 days a year.
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely got a few problems still in Miami, and that sense of community is huge. The idea that successive generations will stay in the same place is huge. The siloing of communities that you talked about, that's huge. These are all problems that have to be addressed, including, you know, the other two. You know, there's always transportation in Miami, and then there's climate change, right? What should we be doing? So, you know, where to begin? That you know, these are enormous issues, and you know, you watch successive politicians here kick these cans down the road. That we haven't had a Maurice Ferré in quite a while, and you know, that's definitely what we need. Big thinkers with big answers. I wish I had the answers for you, but I haven't. I'm about to read Disposable City. I don't know if you've read that one yet, but maybe
I have not.
Maybe he has a few.
But yeah, I mean, you are a historian. You look towards the past. You can't help us so much with the future. So
Right.
I understand. Didn't mean to put you on the spot there. But did this kind of inspire you to look, you know, into other cities' pivotal historical moments? You did mention that you have enough material to do at least, you know, 3 more Miami books. But is this something you're interested in looking at in other places around the country or the world too?
Yeah, I mean, look, I was raised in London. I left when I was 18. I moved to New York for 20 years, and then I came down here. You know, those are all amazing cities, but Miami's special just because I feel it's very underwritten as a city. I mean, you know, maybe there are a dozen books a year. I don't know. I would guess, as opposed to probably 300 on New York, and you know, same in London and obviously other American cities as well. But I would also say that in, you know, even though we're a young city, we're about 120 years old, we've lived through at least 300 years of history here. It just everything happens in Miami. But if you think in 1980 that we only had 310,000 people in the city in 1980, as opposed to probably 6 or 7 million in New York and millions in Chicago. But we were producing more news stories around America than everyone but New York and Chicago. So we were punching way above our weight for all the wrong reasons. Don't get me wrong. News, what's getting printed around the country. We were going through a year from hell, but we're also this incredibly fascinating city. There's nowhere like us in America. We were easily a very important international city before anyone even noticed that we might possibly become an important domestic city. That's one of the key things to take away from this conversation. And that's something that someone like Maurice Ferré realized and capitalized on, that, we think we were in trouble in 1980, and really by American standards, it was an incredibly traumatic year. But, you only have to look to the South to know that every few years in Latin America, there'd be some crisis that would put the things that were happening in Miami in 1980 to shame. So, 1981, you get El Salvador blowing up, and we get Salvadorian immigrants. We had, obviously, the cocaine issues in Colombia that sent a lot of people our way. Now it's, my wife's country, Venezuela, which is sending a lot of people this way. But, we've actually always done well from those crises. We get the brain drain, and we also get capital flight. And a lot of it comes to Miami and strengthens us, and hopefully strengthens our institutions. But it would be nice to have a really powerful local press to make sure to, test those institutions and to make sure everything's actually working.
Absolutely, which is one of the reasons why it is so frustrating that this one tiny little facet of Miami's history is the one that is portrayed the most, when we're 100% aware that there is so much more, even if it is just 100+ years, but there is so much that happened in that history that is still just as intriguing and interesting for people who have never even been to Miami.
Yeah.
We do have a question here that asks, the U.S. Southern Command is now based in Miami. This proves your point that Miami is the capital of Latin America. Are they helping Miami itself?
I don't quite know how to answer that, but I will tell you something, that when my last book was about China-U.S. relations and a very odd British spy who was in the middle of those, and to push that book, I went out and spent, obviously I went to Asia to do a lot of research, but then I went to sell the book as well, and did a book tour, and I was at this event in Hong Kong, and I'd already moved to Miami, and I always felt like I had to explain to Chinese, everything about Miami. And to my shock, no one needed any explanation. The Chinese were very well informed about Miami. Why? For that exact same reason that the US military decided this is the place to keep the Southern Command, because they said it's one of the control points for world trade, and will become even more important. And I thought that was fascinating, that they could be recognized both by the American military and by Chinese investors. So, with the big asterisk above climate change, I would think Miami's in an amazing position for the next 100 years, but obviously that's a really big asterisk.
And what are you going to work on next?
That depends very much on how this book does. If this book does well, and we've started off pretty well, then I'll be able to write another Miami book. If there's not a national appetite for Miami stories, then I'm going to have to go and find another subject. I do have a really good idea for the next Miami book that I'm already, putting together a proposal on. So that's my intention. Whether or not it happens is sort of slightly beyond my control.
Well, you definitely have a fan in that here, so for sure. Ooh, we're getting a few questions actually. Okay, I'm gonna have to pick a few of them because we only have 5 minutes left. As in true Miami fashion, you came here with the questions late, guys. Okay. Here's one question. Colombian cartels have historically used violence to coerce governments. Did the Colombians ever have to use violence in that way in Miami as they expanded their business here?
Did they? Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, the amount of money that you could make, there was no greater opportunity. I mean, the irony was that everything that Maurice Ferré was looking for as far as tempting investors from the South and creating an amazing business inside the United States. That's exactly what the cocaine dealers were doing. You know, it was Ferre's worst nightmare, but that's how it happened. And of course, with these kind of sums available even for the low end of the cocaine industry, and there weren't that many people involved in it inside the United States. You know, there were probably, I think the stat was around 400, you know, Colombians fully employed in the Miami region for cocaine. There were 25 guys who were professional hitmen running around town. So, you know, a whole lot of trouble caused by not that many people, but the stakes were huge. So of course the territorial battles were also huge. You think that a cop in the local county in the mid 70s was given a starting salary of $10,000. You could get $10,000 for one day's work as a lookout on the Miami River. So, you know, which one were you going to do? A lot of people chose B instead of A. Yeah,
absolutely. And is there you know, just as one of the last questions, this is just me as a fan of the book. What was your favorite part to discover or to write about when you were researching the book?
Well, you know, for me, it was easily meeting. I mean, who doesn't want to hang out with a bunch of grizzled old homicide detectives? I mean, that was a lot of fun. Hearing, you know, everyone's got a few stories to tell, and I'll tell you who. You know, he doesn't have a huge role in the book, but I just decided I really loved him. Dr. Joe Davis, who was the coroner at the time and who had been the coroner in Miami since the 60s. And, you know, he saw everything, but he was this incredibly jolly, happy man who sort of taught his dachshund how to sneeze on command and had 7 kids, but spent his days elbow deep in bodies. But just and he charmed everyone. Everyone loved him, whether you were a DA or a reporter or a detective. You know, he was just a universally liked man. So he was someone I wished had still been alive. That would have been a fun person to interview. But yeah,
you did paint a really cool character. It was, although a grisly moment to meet him, still a very fun character to read for sure. So I'm going to start to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Nicholas. This has been so interesting. We could totally have a part 2 anytime you want. So I want to thank everyone here for joining us this evening. I hope it was exciting for you as it was for me. I'm pleased to have been the special host tonight of the Betsy Zen series that they've been working on with FIU Miami Beach Urban Studios since coronavirus came to visit us in late March. So thank you so much, Nicholas.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah.